Good evening all and welcome. Many of you may recall a time, a long time ago, when people used to work in buildings together. A place called an office. Some of you may have heard of it. These horror stories come from the workplace, as co-workers and managers can be especially nasty. So for now, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. I started my first job at Tim Hortons when I was 16 and worked there for many years through high school and university. I could probably add about 10 stories here about inappropriate regulars, but this is the one that really haunts me. I was about 17 to 18 at the time and worked at a local that was only about 10 minutes down the street from my parents' home. A neighbor called Alex lived roughly 8 houses down and started coming in regularly for coffee and small talk with me. Alex was at least 45 to 50, and it turns out he used to work with my dad and had lived in my neighborhood for years. Nothing about our conversation seemed weird or alarming to me. After a few months of completely normal interactions, he found me on Facebook. I accepted because I was young and had no social media boundaries at the time. This is when things started to get weird. He would DM me about things I was posting instead of commenting publicly. He would offer me rides to work or class and would make comments about my hair, makeup and curves. I found out he was married and has a son a few years younger than me. I started ignoring his messages and eventually removed him as a friend. When he came in for his coffees after this, he would ask for my number, wouldn't take no for an answer, and just generally made me feel uncomfortable. I started asking co-workers to serve him, and my manager at the time refused to ban him from the store. I also learned that he used to send a past employee flowers and do the same thing to her. Fast forward a few months, Alex seemed to have gotten the hint and stopped asking for me when he came into my workplace. One evening I was walking my dog around the subdivision and smoking some weed, as I did most nights before bed, and I walked the same route each night, which unfortunately meant I had to pass by his home. On my way back this night, I saw him out of the corner of my eye coming out of his house with a baseball bat. He stood in his front yard for a few minutes, and then I could hear him start walk behind me and I panicked. I was also high and unsure if I should be alarmed. Was this a time to panic? Some kids in the duplex across the street started banging on the window and making a bunch of noise. I was too scared to even look up at them. My dog started getting agitated, and I decided to start running since I was only 2 minutes from home, and figured I could make it inside and lock the door. Alex must have been spooked by the noise and stopped following me. I'm very thankful for those kids who knew that situation did not look right and tried to warn me. It worries me to think about what could have happened if they hadn't. Alex, let's not meet. Ever. I want to start by saying that I still work for this company, and I still have anxiety every time I go to work. The company is huge, one of the biggest names in the world. For the purposes of privacy, let's just call it Big Cheese. I also want to mention that I have crippling social anxiety. I credit this to being homeschooled most of my life, and this will make a lot more sense later. Well, September of last year, I was fresh out of high school and was looking for work. I needed this job immediately because I was living with my significant other and we were barely getting by. My father and grandfather both either worked or had worked for this company for a long period of time, and it was something that garnered a lot of respect in my family. So of course I was thrilled when I got my first interview. It went great and was all set to start training, which involved a few classes and on-the-job training. The classes were awkward to say the least, but nonetheless informative. Well, after the classes had finished, I joined a group of fellow trainees to tour the work environment, and this is where I first met the creepy co-worker. He was in the very back of my group, seemed a little shy, and didn't really talk to the rest of the group unless he was trying to make an awkward joke to join in. At first, I kind of felt bad for him. He seemed harmless, but definitely awkward and out the loop. Knowing as much as I did going into the company, I made an effort to inform him and update him with all the things the trainers were asking of us. He just seemed so lost and confused. I thought I was doing a good thing by helping him out. Even my significant other thought so at the time. The training went by without any hiccups. As soon as we were given the location of where we'd start out, ironically enough, the only person that I had gotten to know, creepy coworker, had the same area I did. Realizing that we'd be starting out together and both didn't know anyone, we decided to exchange phone numbers. That was so that we could both meet up the next week so that we wouldn't get lost. I thought nothing of this when he asked for my number, and just assumed it was more because he was nervous and didn't know anyone besides me. Boy, did I live to regret that. The first day of training, we met up at basically a flagpole so that we could wait up for the job trainer Christy. When he got off the employee shuttle, he started texting me asking where I was. I was in the smoking section a little ways away, killing my fears with a cigarette, and messaged him back telling him where I was, and he asked if he could join. I didn't like how nervous it felt, and I wasn't comfortable with anyone joining me during this time of reprieve. But I saw him coming over anyway, so I scooted over to make room on the bench. This didn't matter, because apparently he was going to sit as close to me as possible anyway. I hate touch or people being in my personal bubble, and being a victim of other trauma, touch was something only people very close to me had permission to do. Creepy coworker then proceeded to ask me if he could bum a cigarette, and I'm not that good at saying no, so gave him one. After he lit up and returned my lighter, I just kind of ignored the unwarranted invasion of my space. We talked since and had about 30 minutes to kill, speaking about normal stuff like how do you feel about the company, where do you want to end up in, and noticed he was wearing tattoo covering sleeves, so asked him about them. He pulled down the sleeves and started going over almost each and every one, all something to do with either a love interest or something geeky. I listened out of mild curiosity, but quickly got uncomfortable when he started pulling out his phone and showing me pictures of ones he drew. I was uncomfortable because he kept showing me pictures of himself as well, mostly photos of him shirtless, and I didn't really find that appropriate. He mentioned he was a Marine and that he had gained too much weight after his last tour. I apologized out of sympathy, but suggested that it was nothing to be ashamed of. Unfortunately, after that, he kept smiling at me in a way I deemed to be admiration. I had seen this look from my fiancé, so I knew somewhere I'd messed up. I quickly turned the conversation to more appropriate stuff like music taste. He seemed interested in what music I liked too much, and decided he should make a playlist. I said it really wasn't necessary, but he insisted. Later into that very day during training, he kept purposefully doing kind things, like taking heavy boxes from my hands, or taking the odd jobs he deemed too grueling for a lady. I was a little annoyed, but mostly just glad the jobs meant that he'd have to go a different area and give me some space. He'd always find a way back to appear beside me and scare me. I hated being scared, and he laughed it off every time. I was more than uncomfortable. At this point, a nervousness had settled in the pit of my stomach. At the end of the night, after we'd been sent to go home and come back the next day, he decided to walk me out. We'd walk back through the maze my workplace actually is, all the way to the employee costume center/lockers, and it was there that we had gotten our work costume and stored our regular clothes in lockers. Well, I was having trouble remembering the combination and couldn't find the little slip of paper that told me it. The creepy coworker came up to me and smirked, seemingly waiting for me to finish up. I thought he had left at this point and wasn't expecting him to still be there. After a few tries, he reached over and out the combination of my locker for me. This was a serious red flag. He had already memorized my combination, and now I felt as though my privacy was completely gone. Again, I, awkward and unsure of what to do in this situation, was like, "Thank you, but suggested that he let me figure it out next time. I was hoping that he would, so that he would forget my combination. Remember this for later. After changing back into my regular clothes in the girls' locker, I came out and he was still waiting for me. I asked him why he had waited, so he could have just gone home sooner, to which he replied, "Because I'm a gentleman. A lady should be walked to her car so that she can be kept safe." I told him that my significant other was waiting to pick me up. He asked where, and I told him down the street like an idiot. I still don't know why I complied with this creep as much as I did, but I had never been in a situation like this before. He told me that was too far for me to walk, and that it wasn't safe, so he offered to drive me to my significant other's car. Due to how tired I was and how much I ached from the day, I didn't have the strength to argue. I mean, he was creepy, but also nice. I chalked up the creepiness to him just being awkward. So without anything else weird happening, he took me to my significant other, whom I had been texting the entire time, just to let him know where I was and what was going on. I had a deep gut feeling that I should text him everything I knew about the guy, so I did. When I pulled up, I immediately got out the car. My boyfriend sat there leaning against the car with his arms crossed. He wasn't very happy about him giving me a ride, but nonetheless thanked the creepy coworker for getting him to me safely. The coworker nodded, seeming to smirk at my boyfriend the whole time. This was when my boyfriend first got a bad feeling about the guy. So we got home and my boyfriend warned me about him, telling me he wasn't getting a good vibe from him. It was not 3 minutes after that I got a text from the coworker. He started sending me songs and memes and telling me things like, "I really feel like you get me." Now I was definitely concerned. What the hell did I get myself into? Why did I have to be so goddamn nice to people? The following day at work, I was on my last day of training and I had a massive pain attack. I have a chronic illness and the situation ended with none of the managers listening to me when I told them that the pain doesn't last and comes and goes. They rushed me to the emergency room. A stretcher carried me through work while I was crying and trying to hide my face. The customers were quick to take out their phones and film the whole thing. It was one of the worst experiences of my life, but what happened next is even worse. I received about 20 texts from the creepy coworker asking how I was. At this point I was done, I just didn't respond, and after a few random memes he started texting me that he was drunk and thinking about not going home to his wife. This was the first time he'd ever mentioned to me he had a wife. I was dumbfounded. Why was he so concerned about me when he had someone else who loved him enough to marry? I didn't respond. I went to bed. In the morning I woke up to my boyfriend looking at my phone in anger. My heart sank and I could only imagine what the creepy coworker had sent now. My boyfriend showed me the only text I had gotten since the night before. It was from his wife texting me from his phone. She wrote a message that the creepy coworker had a problem getting attached to women. She warned me that I should stay away from him and then told me her name, my name. And after that, she explained that my name was a thing for him. All of his exes had that very same name. Now at that point, my boyfriend was telling me not to go back to this job, that it wasn't worth it. But that's not me. I wasn't going to let one creep ruin this opportunity for me. The job meant the world to me, and I never wanted to let it go. So I told him if this continued, I'd go to HR, but in all honesty, I really didn't want to do that. I was the new girl. I didn't want the first month on the job for me to be fighting a harassment case. Biting my nails the whole way I went to work. Suddenly, the creepy coworker wasn't hovering anymore. I thought this might have been him being embarrassed, and I was pretty convinced I wasn't going to have a problem after that. Big mistake. On my lunch break, he made sure to go on his lunch early and come find me. His normally enthusiastic attitude was gone, replaced with what felt like anger. I was scared. He came up to me and let me know that his wife is full of crap and just angry because he was divorcing her. At this point, I didn't want to have anything to do with him, so I kept quiet, hoping that he'd take the hint. He told me he had a gift for me and that he'd give it to me after the shift, quickly walking away before I could respond. After my shift, I go outside of the work area to the lockers. I had waited an extra hour and a half, even taking a closing position from a co-worker just so that he'd go home before me. Well, my lock wasn't locked all the way, and I was now freaked out. I opened the locker to grab my bag and go, but noticed a rolled up piece of drawing paper. I know what kind it is because I am an artist myself. Unrolling it, it was a naked girl that resembled my video game character on World of Warcraft. I had briefly mentioned my WoW addiction to my group on the first group training day. I didn't even realize he had heard any of that, much less memorize the information. Suddenly he walks up, though we should have been long gone by then, and confronts me. He asks me if I like it, and because he seemed angry, I said yes. I suggested he didn't do it anymore as my boyfriend wouldn't like this kind of gift at all. He rolled his eyes and playfully giggled at me, as if I were joking with him, but I wasn't. Not only did he follow me the whole way out of the work grounds, he got me to the employee shuttle that I had to get on to have witnesses. He sat right next to me, leaning on me. I felt like a deer in headlights, mentally begging someone to suggest that he shouldn't be that close to me, but no one paid any attention. Instead, I spent the whole drive trying to get this man to pull his arm off my shoulders, and I felt nauseated and my head was spinning. After we got off, I practically dashed off the bus and ran to my boyfriend, who parked the car at the entrance to the employee parking zone. I got in the car and told him to go. He took off and I started crying. I told my boyfriend and he was pissed. He wanted to turn around and punch the creep, but I talked him out of it through tears. I promised that I would talk to my managers after that. Well, I kept looking for the right time to pull a manager aside, but never got a chance. The next night I went in. Now, creepy co-worker's attitude did a whole 180. He was being extremely weird, playful, and then he crossed the final line. He grabbed my butt where consumers could easily see him. The co-workers kind of laughed and thought it was a game. Because of this, I was pissed and pushed to my limit. I went after him. I legitimately punched him in the ass and shouted in his face, "How do you like that, huh?" Seething, he seemed unfazed by my anger. Instead, he laughed it off and winked at me. I went down to the basement for the employee bathroom and quickly threw up the contents of my stomach, cried in the stall and prayed to God that this would stop. I quickly made an excuse, used my chronic illness, and went home. Fast forward a few weeks. He had completely swapped out his shifts so he wouldn't work with me. I felt like I'd won the battle. I sent a message and he realized he'd crossed boundaries. Until the night before Christmas Eve, I had a terrible feeling as my boyfriend was driving me to work that night. I felt gross. I got to work and he was there, flirting with other girls, suddenly having this big ego I'd never seen him display before. Like I said, when I met him he was shy and awkward. It's like his personality flipped every time I saw him. I never knew which side of him I was going to get on. That night he actually stomped off as all the other co-workers, including myself, closed the joint. We were scrubbing like normal and he didn't seem at all together. So he clocked out early and I relaxed. I figured he'd gotten in trouble since one of our floor managers seemed to be upset that he'd clocked out without permission. I was there extra late. The evening festivities were done for the night, and my zone was pretty much closed off for consumers, so I walked through the massive property that is my work to get to the street. I had started taking new ways to meet my boyfriend, who picked me up so that I couldn't be followed. This time I was going to walk straight out of the grounds and onto the street where the bus stops, where my boyfriend would be waiting at the curb. I was about halfway through my approximately 12-minute walk, and it was a dark area, and out of nowhere, as I'm sure you've already guessed, the creepy co-worker shows up and starts yelling my name and following me from behind. I pretended not to notice and walked faster. He yells my name again and seems angrier, so I sprint for it. I sprint all the way to cross the shuttle zone and end up crashing into someone's chest. Thank God it was my actual boyfriend, who had a really bad feeling and wanted to be as close to my work as possible. I looked back. The creep got on the shuttle and was staring from the window, smiling like the Cheshire Cat the whole time. Never in my life had I been so terrified. After that next night was Christmas Eve, and I was supposed to work, but just knew something bad was going to happen. So crying the whole time because I knew I had to earn a bunch of points for calling out to avoid him, I asked, crying, the lady on the phone if I was going to get fired, and she said she honestly couldn't say. I respected that, but I knew I wasn't done. I wasn't going to let this creep make me lose this job I'd worked so hard to get, even changing my appearance to fit their strict standards. No. So I wrote to the only person I could think of, my trainer Christy. She was the lead, and she was the kindest girl you'd ever meet. Gold of heart. You knew just being her friend meant you'd have a trusted confidant for life. I told her everything, sent her screenshots of the texts he sent me, and finally told someone with an ounce of leadership that I was scared to go to work. Immediately she responded and asked if she could tell the managers, and even though I was incredibly nervous, I told her yes. The next day I was pulled in, and God bless my ex-manager Christopher, because he was shocked at everything that had happened to me and quickly helped me write a report for HR. He led me through the steps and even changed the schedule so I wouldn't be working with the creepy coworker unless he specifically traded shifts. 2 months go by, and I'm well acquainted with the responsibilities for my work at this point, and I'm comfortable, but of course there's no stopping a stalker. He had traded a shift and was working the night shifts with me. He was angry every time he looked at me, and I avoided looking at him at all costs. Then around halfway through my shift, I'm down in the basement coming back from the restroom. I'm walking up the steps that lead down to my work area, and then I feel someone behind me. Before I could think a clear thought, I was pushed against the wall, hand beside my head. He leans in and says, "You should smile more," and then he chuckles and walks away. I feel pretty hysterical at this point and run to the closest lead, crying and trying to explain what happened. It was at this point that my manager Christopher, pissed off that HR was taking so long to investigate my case, went to them to speed it up. Well, after 4 months of an interview process with HR, finally the case was resolved. And not only was he let go, but I was doing really well in my job. Nothing to worry me about not paying attention to my duties. Creepy coworker has left me alone ever since, but sometimes I get random friend requests from guys with no picture and always similar names. Creepy coworker, leave me alone. I won't ever be intimidated again, and I will win every battle you throw at me. Let's never meet again. I used to work at a dessert stand in a local mall. It was one of those cute little single worker booths, meaning most of what I had to do was interact with customers and learn how to use a cash register. When I first began working the job, standing for abnormally long shifts as there was no chairs in the booth, and having so much to memorize was exhausting. Not to mention getting back late, having loads of homework to do. Thanks, high school. It didn't help. I assumed that things weren't going to get much worse since my manager told me it was easy to get the hang of, but boy was I wrong. Generally, people in the mall are polite and communicative, but inevitably you run into some weirdos or entitled people at times, especially in a service job. I was perfectly aware of that, and you sort of get used to the customer patterns as you work. So those people were not much of an inconvenience to interact with. However, just for a bit of context, I'm super awkward, an extra memey type of person who uses humor in bad situations and also has anxiety, which isn't good for social interactions, which means dealing with rather unusual people is a struggle. Oh, I'm feeling lethargic at the same time, because a bit of stuttering and slows my reaction as well. The story. When I had just finished training for this job, there was a presumably middle-aged man who approached the booth. I brightly greeted him, thinking he'd ask questions about desserts. Instead, he mutters something along the lines of, "You're very sweet, you're good," and walks off, assuming that since his English clearly wasn't his first language, he was referring to the food. I ignored it, but I did get this odd feeling about him. With my forced grin and a confused, "Thanks?" he left. My manager, who was working in the nearby food court seats, happened to catch a glimpse of this. She made eye contact with me, clearly uncomfortable, and asked if everything was okay, but I shrugged it off. A few minutes later, he abruptly trotted up again. This time he made wide gestures with his lanky arms while grumbling. "You're lucky to be here. I'm attracted to you, but I'm old. If I wasn't 71 and I was your age, I would date you. Tell your friends and boyfriends that." And then went off in an incomprehensible tangent about my appearance before slinking off again. My tired mind wasn't exactly registering what just happened, so I just stared into the small distance of the mall, spooked to the max. I guess I was frowning pretty profusely since my manager became concerned and quickly slid behind the counter to firmly ask if I was fine, to which I replied there was a slight creepy man who already approached me twice. I told her that it wasn't a big deal, but she knew that I was just trying to dismiss the threat and insisted on staying. She planted herself beside me and we both shared an unsaid feeling that something more was going to happen. Bingo. A few minutes passed before he rushed up to the counter again. He began trying to restate what he was saying earlier through a crooked smile, revealing a row of yellow teeth. He was leaning over the counter as far as he possibly could, and his beady eyes were fixated on my grimace. Startled by his audacity, my manager brusquely hissed, "Can I help you?" To which he moistly breathed, "Oh no, I just wanted to talk to her." Never once did he break eye contact. He continued to tell me how my complexion was very good and that I should tell all my friends and boyfriends that. He went off about how my looks would be good for sale. His speech was very repetitive and just plain off-putting. At this point, my manager and I were both thinking that the dude is clearly not in his right mind on multiple levels, and we might need to call some extra help. Also, bro, I'm ugly as hell, so you must be crazy thinking otherwise. He did end up leaving pretty quickly after that, but I can't imagine what else he had planned doing if my manager hadn't been there. I guess her presence did end up scaring him off since he didn't return that night. Although scared for the rest of the shift, I tried to work through it, deciding that I simply came across a rare occasion and was thankful that I didn't have a stalker or something worse. I thought I was just unlucky that one time. After that incident, I put the mall security number in my contacts, not expecting to have to use it just in case. Well, next week comes by. I came back and started my shift early, and immediately while scanning the possible customers I spotted the same guy just a seat several yards away, eyes closed. He was facing the booth and it appeared as though he were waiting for something. He was stationary for 20 minutes before suddenly rising and patrolling the area. I ducked behind the boxes on the counter, and by some miracle the man didn't see me and exited the building. Thankfully, I haven't seen him since. The idea that he regularly comes to the mall truly is sickening. The idea that he was likely coming back to that area, as the same time he was there the first time, just to be a creep again is even more disgusting. I am a waitress at a local Italian restaurant that also does deliveries and pickups. One day, I would say a year ago, a man came into my place to carry an order. A girl I work with noticed him walking up to the door and asked me if I could take care of him. I said yes, not really thinking anything of it, and she walked back into the kitchen. He came in, and I could see why she had asked me to serve him. He immediately gave me the creeps. He was an older man, short and stout, wearing a big coat and a winter hat. He reeked like someone who had smoked an entire pack of cigarettes while walking through piles of cow poo. Thinking of it now in my apartment all alone, I can still smell him. What really scared me was the way he stared into my face. Chin turned down towards his chest, looking up at me through his eyebrows. The stare made me feel like he was thinking of every possible way to torture me. He didn't say much, just sort of growled his order of me. He paid and waited behind the counter for his pizza to take home. He would pace with his hands locked behind his back, while never shaking that stare. Even when he would turn to pace the other way, he never shook his glance away from me even for a second. Being that I'm working behind this counter, I can't really go anywhere in case someone calls or comes to get their order, so I just stood there, waiting for the clock for his order to be done so he could leave. Once he was gone, I asked my co-worker if she knew anything about him and why she wanted me to take care of him. She told me that he gives her the creeps and that he was a registered offender, but never went into the details of his charges. And honestly, I didn't even want to know. I still thought about him for the rest of the day and looked twice before getting into my car at the end of the night. But sure enough, I soon forgot about him. Unfortunately, it didn't last. He began to go in very frequently. At first, maybe once every other week, then every day. Every time he would order the same thing, and began his pacing with that burning stare. Every chance I would run to the kitchen or get away from the counter, I would. My co-worker would make jokes about how much he liked me, saying he has never stared that hard at any other worker in that way before. These jokes didn't make me feel better, to say the least. The jokes halted when we noticed his pattern. We noticed that he only comes in when I would be working. We started to suspect that he recognized my car. I never had the same schedule, but I always parked in the same spot in our very open parking lot, so you'd always be able to tell who was there if you knew their cars. The shifts that I would work were a little strange as well. There was a very, very dead time at the day where we would cut half the staff, giving us a break for a few hours long. He began to come in sometimes twice a day I was working. He would come in while I would work in my morning shift and then come again from my evening shift. Or maybe it was just a crazy coincidence. Nevertheless, it freaked me the hell out. One night after working a double shift on a Saturday, I had walked out to my old car, which I never locked. 3 out of the 4 doors on my car were broken in some way, so it's easiest to just keep them unlocked at all times. And I could admit, that car was a piece of crap. No one would have dared steal it, so I never worried about it. Until this particular night, I got into my car and immediately noticed the stench. My car reeked exactly like the man. That same smell of non-menthol cigarettes and cow poo was around me. I had completely convinced the man had been in my car that day. Since then, I had someone escort me to my car every night, and I haven't seen that man in the last year. I hope you take your business elsewhere, creep. Let's never meet again. My life hasn't always been the best. A rough childhood and a string of horrible abusive relationships made life that much harder, and I was feeling as though I had hit rock bottom. The fall before college, I landed a job to save up on money and keep my mind occupied. December 2018, my job had recently laid out the plans for a company merge and was in desperate need to hire more help to make sure things went smoothly, both with the upcoming merge and the holiday season. I was about 3 months into this job, and at the same time very comfortable with the position and duties. My co-workers were very friendly, and though we could be classified as a dysfunctional family, we made it work. My boss had just hired a few more people, a couple of cashiers and a shift supervisor to get trained as quickly as possible and throw into the mess. All the new people seemed nice enough, and though I'm naturally a social person, I'm not very trusting. A week goes by and I'm put on night shifts with the new lead, and my first thought of him was, the guy seems pretty easygoing and harmless. But I was wrong. He seemed to be having a hard time adjusting, and to make him feel better, I would help him learn the job as best I could. He seemed friendly overall, always willing to help you if you needed it, and the regulars liked him. Everything was going smooth until my gut told me something was up. I personally wouldn't like to talk about myself because it makes me feel selfish, so my co-workers' knowledge of my personal life is limited to what I'll be doing after the shift, and that I had a younger brother who came into the store often, so when this man started to mention things, I never told anyone at the job unless it was necessary, as I was uneasy. My first paranoid thought was that he had found my Instagram, which at the time was public. I don't have other social media, but figured it was just that. Weeks go by, uneventful aside from the man making comments about his sex life to me and describing his ideal woman. He tries to befriend my little brother, a minor, and asks him to hang out with him sometimes. This man is in his 30s. My brother told me he didn't like the guy the moment he met him because he gave off serious creeper vibes. Maybe it was the inappropriate jokes, advances, abuses of power, talking bad about me, talking about him, or him constantly asking other employees where I was, even if I wasn't scheduled. But I started to feel very scared around him. I had co-workers come to me the day after their shifts with him, uncomfortable because the whole night he'd been going on about me when he barely knew me. He'd watch security cameras and call me from the office just to try and talk to me about the job and personal life. I didn't have a vehicle at the time, so my current partner, who was a saving grace, would pick me up from work. He had found out about my boyfriend. He threatened to beat him up on multiple occasions, as well as throwing things in my office when my boyfriend would pick me up from work. One night in particular, my brother got out from his job at the same time we closed and decided to swing by and pick me up. The psycho got in his car and followed us home. I was so scared I didn't sleep all night. I was terrified to work with him and asked my boss to throw me on morning shift so that I wouldn't have to see him. Thankfully he did, and I only had to see this man for a few moments as I was leaving to go home. After the merge, everyone went their own ways, and I haven't seen him since. But he has tried to contact me via social media recently, asking how I am and where I'm living. Because of him, I'm always watching my back, especially in my hometown. I'm paranoid he'll find me. I used to work in a carousel at a shopping mall in France. It was the third biggest in Europe, so rather large. The first time I worked there, as it was owned by my parents, I was 13 and not really used to Parisian life. I came from a small town in the south, so it was really weird for me to be here. But one day a guy, between 20 and 30, was sitting on a bench and looking at me. He seemed quite nice, and at first I thought he was a parent or something looking at his child. He was completely alone and only looking at me. I awkwardly smiled and said, "Hello," thinking he needed some help. He kept smiling, and that's when I started to get scared. But I kept doing my work, looking at another bench to make him understand that I was uncomfortable. 5 minutes later he moved, sitting on the bench that I was looking at. He wasn't really smiling and looked kind of disappointed. So I started looking up, because people could look at the carousel from there. When I looked down again 10 minutes later, the guy was gone. I thought he left, but he was still looking at me from the first floor with that horrible smile. He stood there for a whole hour and continued changing so I would notice him. When I left work, he followed me, so I told my co-worker to accompany me until I got home. That was a real creep. He came back in on random days and did the same thing, but now it's been at least 6 months and I haven't seen him. Last year I also had a pause and decided to go to the nearest bookshop, and as I did, I found a book that I really wanted to get, a Tolkien book. There was a guy there who looked at me and made a Tolkien reference. I laughed and just left. 20 minutes later, the same guy was on a bench next to me at the carousel and looked at me and smiled. And he came to see me and asked for my number. I said I didn't give it out to strangers, but he kept insisting. Then I asked him his number and told him that I'd text him when I was done with work, but of course never did. He came back 2 days after, but I didn't see him. I noticed him following me when I was in the same bookshop. I was moving randomly to see if he was really following me. He was. So I walked towards him and asked why he kept doing this. He then said he was in love with me, that I reminded him of his ex-girlfriend and that he wanted to get to know me. I said I was in a relationship, and he said it was okay. He could be a third wheel, that I could just text him whenever I felt like it. Maybe a month after that, I was going to a big convention where I was cosplaying as a random maid. I was holding a free hugs cardboard with some random drawings on it, and with 2 friends, and we were having a ton of fun. When out of nowhere, someone jumps up and hugs me. It was this dude. We called security and he kept screaming that I was the love of his life and that he would end his own life if he couldn't be with me. Apparently he asked my coworker why I wasn't there, and she thought he was a friend of mine and said that I was going to a convention. He came to search for me. I never saw him after that, and then I blocked his number. Final story happened in December of 2018. I had 2 jobs, but in the same mall. A guy of about 20 to 30 with long hair was sitting on a bench next to the carousel and kept on looking at me. He sat there all day. Who does that? And I noticed that he was sometimes raising his phone and moving it in my direction, almost as if he were taking pictures of me or filming me. I was 15. You're not supposed to take pictures of minors. Plus, the way he looked at me was very strange, and I even caught him licking his lips while looking at me. I felt really uncomfortable, but kept on working and said nothing. The next day, I was working my other job, which was another carousel, and was only here for the Christmas holidays. I didn't see him, but when I left my job and was waiting for my parents to get ready so that we could go home, the guy sat next to me really close and asked for my number. I said no, and he looked down, very disappointed, and asked if I was working tomorrow. I asked, "I don't know. Why'd you ask?" "'Cause I like your body." He then stood up and left. I really didn't want to go to work the next day, so I told my co-worker Lionel, another co-worker, about what happened. I could hardly sleep that night. Was really paranoid about everything around me. Then I saw the guy and told Lionel to ask him to stop following me like that. He came back with a huge smile, saying, and I'm not kidding by the way, "It's okay. You two will go on a date." Apparently the guy told my co-worker that he was a friend of mine and was messing with me. He said he was really shy in playing this game, so he would have this confidence to ask me on a date. I felt so strange, as if I was going to fall. I stopped working that afternoon and told my parents. They told me to stay with them and immediately tell me if I saw the guy again. As we were leaving, I swear I saw the guy with a hoodie under the rain. The next day, I was with another co-worker and saw the guy on the bench next to the carousel. When I told her, she ran towards him and yelled at him stuff that I couldn't hear, but I could see the guy's face and it was priceless. She returned with a big smile and the guy left me alone forever. Apparently she said that she knows where he lives, and if he saw him around, she will blow his brains out. Thankfully, I never saw the guy again. In any case, 3 creepers. Let's not meet. Hey guys, it's Mort here. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed tonight's stories. Yes, people can be creepy. It is a well-known fact. And they were. If anything creepy has ever happened to you, you can let me know and send it to me, and I'd really, really appreciate that. You know I love that kind of stuff. I'd like to also give an extra thanks to my members and patrons, whose names are on screen, for your continued and invaluable help and support to help keep this channel running. If you want to pledge, I don't know, a few bucks every month to help out, that'd be cool, but you don't have to. It's fine either way. The content will still be here every night. So for now, stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.